Hello and welcome to another episode of EB Cubes here on Milo the Gathering. Today I thought I would go over a few of my favorite cards from Cube in a segment I call the Cube Spotlight. So basically, these are cards that really shine in Cube and don't have another format. One of the things I really like about Cube is getting to play with cards that don't really have another home, even though they may be powerful or unique or very cool. So the cards I'm going to go over, one of each color, are cards that shine in Cube and not really anywhere else. They may have had their day in Standard, they may have had, a deck here or there, but really for the past several years they've only been in Cube. These are also cards that have survived the onslaught of new cards. With every set release, there are lots and lots of options to go into Cube, and oftentimes those new cards bump an older card out. So all the cards I'm going to look at have survived that process and really have been around for as long as Cube itself has been around. And all of these cards are powerful and unique. So in many cases, the reason they've stayed around is because there isn't a card quite like them, or Wizards just doesn't print things like that. They may have been considered mistakes at the time, things like that. So without further ado, let's take a look at our first color, which is green, with Channel. So Channel is a card that obviously has been around since the very beginning. This is a card from Alpha. The obvious combination with Channel is Fireball. So you just pump your life into mana and turn that into damage for the opponent. So you will obviously need a little bit more because you'll only have 19 life. But in Cube, I find that there are definitely more interesting options than just the old school Fireball route. One of which is the Eldrazi. So with the printing of Eldrazi, Channel became a lot more powerful in Cube. Channel's very cool with the Eldrazi because of the fact that it allows you to cast them legitimately. So if you have Channel and Emrakul, turn 2, tap your 2 forests, Channel, pay 15 life, and put Emrakul out there, you've cast Emrakul. It will give you the Time Walk ability, and that can be a very, very big deal. That's true, of course, for the others, Kozilek, Ulamog, and it provides a very cool interaction. So Eldrazi obviously being the biggest of those creatures that you can play. But I would also say with newer colorless planeswalkers, Channel also finds a home. Channel into Karn, very, very good, or the new big guy on the block, Ugin. So channel Ugin, and start going to work with that, or Karn, and it can be very, very devastating for the opponent, especially because channel only costs 2 green mana. So that's our green choice. Next up, blue. And in blue I've chosen Palinchron. This is, again, a card that doesn't really see play outside of Cube. It had its heyday. It was an infinite mana combo way back in Urza's Standard or Urza's Block, I think. May have popped up from here and there, but really in the last several years, even up to 10 years, only in Cube. Palinchron costs 7 and is a 4/5 flyer. But the truth about it is that if you have the 7 mana, it's free. And just as is, it's okay. So getting to play a 4/5 flyer while still having 7 mana open for either bouncing it, it's 2 and 2 blue to return it to its owner's hand, or holding up your counterspell, holding up some protection, or just anything else, or being even able to play another 6 or 7 drop after having played Palinchron can be quite good. Its bounce ability, that 2 and 2 blue to return it to its owner's hand, is actually part of its combo potential. And that leads me to Phantasmal Image. Another card in Cube, a newer edition, obviously. But if you have a Palinchron in play, and you play a Phantasmal Image copying it, you have infinite mana. 2 mana to play the Phantasmal Image, 4 mana to bounce it back to your hand, and if you've got 7 lands, that's net gain of 1 mana. So if you keep doing that, you're literally just playing the Phantasmal Image again and again to net 1 mana each time. That can obviously then go into something like Stroke of Genius. If that's in the Cube and you're playing it, you can deck your opponent. Again, similar to Channel, you can just have a Fireball effect with a bit of red mana to deal damage to them and get them out of the game. Phantasmal Image in Palinchron also works surprisingly well with Porphyros, God of the Forge, because you're playing a creature every time, so Porphyros is dealing 2 damage each time. That combo can also just kill the opponent. So lots of potential there with something like Phantasmal Image. Another infinite mana combo is Sneak Attack. So cheating Palinchron into play works very well. With Sneak Attack, it actually requires even 1 less mana. So if you have 6 mana, Sneak Attack in play into Palinchron, that is infinite mana. 1 red to play it, 4 to bounce it, net gain of 1 if you have 6 lands. Other ways of cheating it into play, just graveyard recursion, getting it to cast it for free from your hand with show and tell or something works as well. And that's because Palinchron works as written on the card. For a while it was errated so that you had to cast it in order to untap the 7 lands. But with a rules cleanup a few years ago, they said, no. If it just comes into play, then you get to untap the 7 lands, which makes it quite good. In red, we have Squee Goblin Nabob. On the surface, a card that doesn't actually look that powerful. 3 mana for a 1/1 Goblin. But if he's in the graveyard during your upkeep, you can return him to your hand. And of course, that's where the entire power of the card lies. Way back when Milo first built his cube, the best combination was Masticore. So you would have your Masticore in play and not worry about getting locked out or having cards in hand, because Squee would always do that for you. You'd simply stack Masticore, stack Squee effect, return Squee to your hand, and then discard it to the Masticore effect. So it made the Masticore very playable and one of the top combos in old school Cube. Nowadays, you can do better things with your Squee. I think Survival of the Fittest is a fantastic option. Squee is just always a creature to discard, so you can keep getting whatever creature you want with Survival. Or with a newer edition like Pack Rat, just again, more hand fodder to keep making Pack Rats. So he fits in very nicely with cards like that. Obviously, also fits in very well when you're doing things like using Bazaar of Baghdad or you're looting. With Bazaar, he kind of gives you a bit of parity. So draw 2, discard 3, but one of the 3 you're discarding is Squee, so kind of keeps you afloat a little bit better. With looting, I mean, any looters, Looter Ilkor, Merfolk Looter, whatever it is, if you're able to discard a Squee, that's, can incrementally gain you that card advantage, which is very nice. Even without these other particular combos, things like Siege Gang Commander or Skull Clamp work pretty well with Squee. Siege Gang obviously chucks goblins, so he's a goblin. You can deal 2 damage with him if you play him. And if you're in a situation where you've just got a Skull Clamp and you need to draw some cards, play your Squee and Skull Clamp him. So obviously you want multiple cards that can make use of a card like Squee in your deck, but in Cube they exist, and that's why he's hung around for so long. On to our next color. In black, we have Recurring Nightmare. Recurring Nightmare being one of the best cards in Cube, in my opinion. A very unique card, a very powerful effect for the mana cost, and especially something that you can use multiple times in a turn. Works very well with 1/8/7 creatures. Those are creatures with their come into play abilities. Used to be things like Necrotals and Bone Shredders and whatnot. As more and more sets get printed, more and more comes into play creatures exist. So playing it with things like Thragtusk, or another old school card was Kakusho because of that 5 life drain. Newer cards even like Scuttling Doom Engine. You can end the game pretty quickly if you're bringing that in and out of play with a Recurring Nightmare. Recurring Nightmare obviously works very well with discard outlets. That's one of the things that you definitely want in your deck if you're playing Recurring Nightmare. I mean, a dream scenario, imagine, and something that happens commonly enough is turn 2, play your Una's Prowler, turn 3, attack with Una's Prowler, discard Grizzlebrand, play Recurring Nightmare, and then switch out your Una's Prowler for the old Grizzle Daddy. And, feels very good. Feels real nice to do that, and all on turn 3 legitimately, just with 3 mana. Another interesting thing about Recurring Nightmare, and something everybody should know if they're going to play with it, is that it protects itself. So, how, you ask? Well, let's say you play Recurring Nightmare, you pay its mana cost, and it comes into play. You, as the active player, have priority to do anything before your opponent does. So, what that means is even though you play the ability as a sorcery, once it's come into play, you pay the cost. So, the cost would be sacrifice a creature and return Recurring Nightmare to its owner's hand. So your opponent will actually never have an opportunity to disenchant it because as part of the cost of using it, it's already in your hand. Now that obviously means that you need to play it properly. So a bad idea is to play a Recurring Nightmare and then activate another ability before using it. Because if you do that, your opponent will get priority and they can disenchant it. And then you can't respond to them disenchanting it by trying to bounce it to your hand or anything. You wouldn't be able to do that. You can only bounce it to your hand with protection, basically, uh, directly after you've played it before passing priority. So keep that in mind. Don't leave Recurring Nightmare sitting out there on the board open to removal. Use it as soon as you play it. On to our next card. In white, we have Parallax Wave. Another one of these cards that, just doesn't see play outside of Cube, I think. Maybe in Commander or something like that a little bit. But essentially what it does is it has Fading 5. It's got 5 counters on it. At instant speed, you can remove a counter to exile a creature for as long as Parallax Wave is in play. During your upkeep, you remove a counter, so it fades. Parallax Wave, in many ways, acts as a one-sided Wrath of God. And because of its instant speed activation, I mean, you can actually use it for tricks. So if somebody wants to play their Rancor on a creature while you have Parallax Wave out, zoop, exile that creature so that the Rancor goes to the graveyard. Or, it works that way with lots of different effects because of the instant speed. I love using Parallax Wave in aggressive decks, where if I've got a bunch of dudes out who really want to get through, and they've played a couple blockers and think they're safe, Parallax Wave comes down, removes the blockers, and allows me to attack. So it can be very, very powerful that way. Also, if you want to get tricky with something like Parallax Wave, Venser or Core Skyfisher work very well. Venser, just use his plus ability and remove Parallax Wave from play and put it back into play. Obviously, when you remove it from play, the creatures come back. But when Parallax Wave comes back, it's got its full 5 counters, and you can start getting back to work. Core Skyfisher, again, is an interesting interaction because when it comes into play, you have to return another permanent to your hand. So it can act as a reset switch for Parallax Wave. That's one of the things about Cube. The more use you can keep generating out of cards, the better it is. Those are kind of the good value combinations you're really looking for. But as I mentioned, even just as is, single-sided Wrath, get your attackers through, very, very effective. And next up, we have our multicolored card. And our gold card is Mystic Snake. Mystic Snake has been around since the beginning of Cube. I think Milo's had it in his cube the entire time. It's 1 green, blue, blue, counter spell, 2/2, and it obviously has flash to be played as an instant. Mystic Snake is basically just a counter spell on legs, so it doesn't have any stipulations. It doesn't counter only non-creatures or, unless they pay 3 or anything like that. It's a hard counter, which is great in Cube. And the fact that it comes with a Grizzly Bear attached actually makes it very, very useful. I'd also say with Mystic Snake, if you can get something like a Crystal Shard or Erratic Portal, that can be a soft lock that's very difficult to get out of. Basically just, use the shard or the portal to bounce the Mystic Snake back to your hand when you need to, and then replay it to counter a spell again. Because Mystic Snake is a creature, if it ever ends up in the graveyard or anything like that, it's also easier to get back than an instant would be. But getting that reusability out of Crystal Shard or Erratic Portal is very, very good. And speaking of reusability, you could also use something like a Blink effect. That would be Momentary Blink is a good one in Cube, or Restoration Angel. You just have to make sure that the Blink effect removes the card, as in exiles it, and then returns it immediately to play. So something that removes it and then brings it back end of turn obviously doesn't work. but Momentary Blink and Restoration Angel do a really good job of getting more use out of that Mystic Snake. And as I mentioned, it's a hard counter, and if you're hard countering a few spells in cube, the opponent can start to get really far behind. Onto the lands. For lands, I've chosen Volrath Stronghold. Volrath Stronghold, been around since Milo built his cube, over 10 years ago, 12 years ago, and it's stuck around. Great thing about it is that it taps for mana. So like any good land, and especially in cube where each turn matters, it doesn't come into play tapped. You don't take a damage for tapping it. You don't have to sacrifice a creature to tap it or do anything like that. It's just a normal land that taps for colorless. So it always has that basic utility. Obviously, you're not playing it just to get colorless mana out of it. You want creature recursion, and Volrath Stronghold does that very, very well. For the low cost of 1 and a black and it tapped, you put the creature from your graveyard on top of your library. It's not really card advantage. I mean, it's not putting it back into your hand. You do have to draw it during your next draw, but it works quite well, and it can be very annoying for an opponent when you keep recurring a creature. So imagine you're playing something like what's that Merfolk Nemesis guy? I always forget his name. That 3/1 that has protection from everything. If they've dealt with it somehow through edict effects, and you play it again, I mean, that can be very, very, very difficult for them. But beyond that, Volrath Stronghold has another very interesting use, which is that it's mill insurance. So if your opponent is on a mill plan, let's say you're playing in a cube where they've got Brain Freeze, something like that, they mill your entire library into your graveyard, looks like you're going to die during your upkeep. Nope. Use Volrath Stronghold, put a creature onto the top of your library, draw that instead. So at that point, you've avoided the mill death, and potentially that other player's gone all in, and now it's just over for them. So that ability comes in really, really useful. It's also cool to note that Volrath Stronghold has sort of a cousin in cube, which is Academy Ruins. So Academy Ruins is obviously a newer card. Adds colorless just the same. Everything's the same, except it taps with 1 and a blue in it, and it returns artifacts to the top of your library instead of creatures. A very effective card, very cool, and obviously based on Volrath Stronghold. And speaking of Academy Ruins, that actually leads us to our final card in the artifact category, Chaos Orb. Chaos Orb works wonderfully well with Academy Ruins, but Chaos Orb is a special case where it really highlights Cube's impact on Magic. Chaos Orb was a completely unplayable card. Being a manual dexterity card, it was essentially removed from the Magic playing field. You're not supposed to be flipping things or worrying about the spacing of your cards on the table, all that sort of stuff. So that's all gone. But with Cube, Chaos Orb was given new life and was turned into a colorless Vindicate. So the way you play Chaos Orb in Cube is just by paying its casting cost, and then 1 mana, tap, and sacrifice, and destroy target permanent. As you can see from the image we've got here, the text just doesn't matter because it doesn't do what's written on the text. So if you've got a Chaos Orb, I suppose it might as well be altered like this. With Chaos Orb, as I mentioned, you can also get a little bit tricky with some of the synergies. Academy Ruins, again the Volrath Stronghold for artifacts. If you have a Chaos Orb, that's just very, very devastating, very difficult to deal with from your opponent's perspective. Another card that works quite well with it, Sun Titan. So use your Chaos Orb, play Sun Titan, brings it right back. Use it again, attack with Sun Titan, brings the Chaos Orb back again. So that can in itself get very, very messy. So I hope you've enjoyed this Cube Spotlight. As I mentioned, Cube is a great format for bringing old cards out of the woodworks or kind of breathing new life into cards that just seemed outclassed in Constructed or other formats, but can be very, very fun in Cube.